The village of Black Hollow sits on the edge of a sprawling, mist-covered marshland. Isolated and forgotten by time, it's the kind of place where shadows stretch just a little too far, and whispers travel on the cold wind long after the sun sets. When Eliza Wren, a school teacher fleeing from her past, arrives to take up residence in the abandoned Hawthorn Estate, she finds herself drawn into a series of unsettling events. Footsteps echo in empty halls. Children speak of shadowy figures near the marsh, and an old crumbling manuscript hints at a terrible secret buried beneath the stagnant waters. The villagers avoid the marsh after nightfall, muttering about the forgotten ones, figures lost to time, wandering between life and death, calling out to anyone foolish enough to listen. But Eliza is already listening, and something is listening back. The fog rolled in thick and heavy as the carriage creaked its way along the narrow, overgrown path toward Hawthorn Estate. The skeletal branches of gnarled trees reached overhead, clawing at the pale gray sky. Inside the carriage, Eliza Wren clutched her suitcase tightly. Her gloved hands trembled slightly, though whether from cold or dread, she couldn't be sure. The driver, a wiry man named Silas, glanced back at her. His face was lined and weathered, and his pale eyes held a faint flicker of unease. "You sure about this, miss?" Silas asked, his voice rough as gravel. "That old estate, it ain't exactly welcoming, especially not this time of year." Eliza forced a thin smile. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Silas, but I assure you, I'll be fine." Silas shrugged, muttering something under his breath as he turned back to the path ahead. The carriage jostled over a deep rut in the road, and Eliza caught her first glimpse of Hawthorn Estate. It rose from the mist like a jagged tooth, a sprawling, Gothic structure with cracked stone walls and towering, narrow windows that seemed to watch her as she approached. The estate stood on the edge of the marsh, its foundations sinking slightly into the muddy earth. The fog clung to its walls like a shroud, and somewhere in the distance, a lone crow cawed into the silence. Silas pulled the carriage to a stop. "This is as far as I go, miss. You'll have to walk the rest of the way." Eliza stepped out onto the damp earth, her boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. She turned to thank Silas, but the carriage was already turning back down the path, disappearing into the fog without another word. She was alone. The front doors of Hawthorn Estate groaned in protest as Eliza pushed them open. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic, something like rust or blood. The grand foyer was covered in dust, and the once elegant chandelier above hung crooked, its crystals dulled and coated with cobwebs. Eliza's footsteps echoed as she crossed the marble floor and set her suitcase down by the staircase. "Home, sweet home," she muttered under her breath. She explored the estate cautiously. The parlor was filled with faded velvet chairs and towering bookshelves. The dining room's long oak table was covered with a sheet, and faint footprints dotted the dust-covered floor. But it was the study that drew her in. The walls were lined with books, their spines cracked and faded. Papers were scattered across a heavy mahogany desk, and a large window overlooked the marshland below. On the desk, half buried under yellowed pages, was an old leather-bound manuscript. The cover was embossed with gold lettering, now faded and cracked. "The Forgotten Ones." Eliza's brow furrowed as she carefully opened the book. The handwriting inside was uneven, frantic. The ink had bled in places, smearing the words. "They come at night, in the mist. They call out in voices that are almost human, but..." Wrong. They watch from the edge of the marsh, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They are the forgotten ones, and they cannot leave. Do not listen when they call your name. Do not follow the voices into the marsh. If you hear them, close the window, lock the door, and pray they pass you by. A sudden sound, a faint tap, 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 startled Eliza. She turned sharply toward the window. Outside, the fog had thickened, swirling like living smoke, and just beyond the glass, she saw it, a figure. It stood motionless at the edge of the marsh, barely visible through the mist. Its face was obscured, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, and utterly still. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, but this time, it came from inside the study. She turned slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. The manuscript lay open on the desk. The ink on the page seemed wet, fresh, and scrawled across the parchment, in uneven letters, were 3 words: "We see you." Eliza slammed the manuscript shut and backed away from the desk. Her heart was racing, her breath sharp and shallow. The sound of faint whispers drifted from somewhere deep in the house. Soft, overlapping voices that spoke in tongues she couldn't understand. The floorboards creaked above her. Something was moving on the second floor. She grabbed the lantern from the desk and held it high, the weak light casting trembling shadows across the walls. "Eliza." The voice was faint, stretched out across the syllables like wind through a cracked window pane. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there, only the open doorway leading back to the grand foyer. "Eliza," the voice came again, this time from above. "Hey!" She stepped backward until her heel hit the edge of the desk. The lantern flickered. The whispers grew louder, and then, from somewhere deep in the marsh beyond the window, came the faint, distant sound of laughter. But it wasn't joyful. It was hollow, sharp, and dripping with malice. Eliza's grip on the lantern tightened as she forced herself toward the grand staircase. Whatever had been calling her, whatever was watching from the marsh. It wasn't done yet, and Hawthorn Estate had far more secrets to share. The grand staircase creaked beneath Eliza's hesitant steps, each sound like a faint exhalation from the house itself. Her lantern flickered with every breath of cold air that snuck through the gaps in the ancient stone walls. Shadows crawled along the staircase railing, stretching and retreating as if alive. "Eliza." The faint whisper echoed again, weaving through the still air. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was inside her ears, inside her head, curling around her thoughts like smoke. She paused halfway up the stairs, clutching the railing tightly. Her pulse hammered in her neck as she turned her head slowly toward the source of the voice. A door at the end of the hallway upstairs stood slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from within. It wasn't the golden flicker of lantern light. It was blue, pale, and unnatural. The manuscript's warning echoed in her mind. Do not listen when they call your name. Do not follow the voices into the marsh. But it wasn't the marsh calling her now. It was coming from inside the house. The hallway stretched before her like the gullet of some sleeping beast, narrow, damp, and lined with peeling wallpaper. Faded portraits of stern-faced strangers hung on the walls, their hollow eyes following her every step. The door at the end of the hallway remained ajar, and the pale blue light pulsed faintly from within, casting faint silhouettes across the floorboards. Eliza stepped closer, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dust. Her lantern trembled in her hand, the flame sputtering in protest. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room beyond was small. A bedroom, perhaps, though whatever purpose it once served had been lost to decay. The wallpaper was peeling, the bed reduced to a skeletal frame draped in moth-eaten sheets. In the center of the room stood an antique rocking chair, its wooden frame cracked and splintered. The chair rocked slowly, creaking with each motion, though there was no one sitting in it. But it wasn't the chair that held Eliza's attention. It was the mirror, hanging on the opposite wall. The surface of the mirror was fractured, its glass webbed with jagged cracks. Yet, despite its damage, the mirror's reflection was clear, unnaturally so. And in that reflection, Eliza saw herself, but not quite. The figure in the mirror was smiling, not a warm smile, not a kind one. A wide, frozen grin stretched across the reflection's face, its lips pale, its teeth faintly yellowed, and its eyes. The eyes of the reflection were black, hollow, endless. "Eliza," the reflection whispered. The smile widened, splitting the corners of its mouth as if the skin itself were tearing. Eliza stumbled back, knocking over a small, wooden table. The crash echoed through the silent room, but the reflection remained unchanged, its grin etched into its pale face. The whispers rose again, overlapping and blending into an unintelligible hum. And then, slowly, the reflection raised one pale hand and pointed behind her. Eliza froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her lantern shook in her trembling grip. She turned around. The rocking chair had stopped moving. But now, someone was sitting in it. A child, perhaps 10 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned white nightgown stained with dark patches. The child's head was tilted downward, their tangled black hair hanging like a curtain over their face. The lantern's light flickered, struggling to stay alive. "Eliza," the child whispered, their voice soft, thin, and impossibly cold. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Slowly, the child's head began to rise. Beneath the curtain of tangled hair, two hollow black eyes stared back at her. The child's lips began to stretch into a grin, a smile that looked too wide, too sharp. "Eliza, it's so cold down there." Eliza screamed and stumbled backward out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. The lantern fell from her hand, its fragile glass shattering against the floor. The flame died instantly, plunging the hallway into darkness. But the whispering didn't stop. "Eliza. Eliza. Eliza." She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the ancient floorboards as she rushed down the hallway and back to the staircase. The shadows moved along the walls, following her like living ink. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping for breath, her hands clutching at her chest. The house was alive. It was breathing around her, watching her, whispering to her. And she couldn't escape it. Hours later, dawn. The faint light of dawn seeped through the cracked windows of the estate. Eliza sat, curled, in the corner of the parlor, clutching a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. The manuscript from the study lay open on the floor in front of her. The words on the pages were smeared now, as if they had been rewritten overnight. At the bottom of the most recent page, in thick, uneven letters, someone, or something, had scrawled, "Come to the marsh. Her breath hitched. Her trembling hands hovered over the words, her eyes wide with terror. A faint sound came from somewhere outside, a low, distant humming. It was melodic, almost like a lullaby. Eliza rose shakily to her feet and approached the window. Outside, the marsh stretched endlessly into the pale morning mist. The water was still and glassy, reflecting the weak dawn light. But there, standing on the edge of the marsh, were figures, dozens of them. Their outlines were faint, distorted by the mist, but they were unmistakably human. They stood still, unmoving, their hollow eyes fixed on the estate. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the glass panes. Eliza stumbled away from the window, clutching the manuscript to her chest. The warning from the book echoed in her mind. "Do not follow the voices into the marsh!" But the humming was pulling at her. It was soft, it was gentle, and it was calling her name. Eliza. She couldn't stop herself from whispering back. "Yes?" The figures didn't move. But one of them, taller, broader, slowly raised its arm and pointed toward the marsh. Eliza's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold wooden floor. She knew one thing with certainty. If she went to the marsh, she wouldn't come back. The marsh hummed. It wasn't a sound Eliza could quite place. It wasn't the low drone of insects or the distant croak of frogs. No, this sound was alive. It reverberated through the floorboards, slithered across the air, and nestled deep inside her chest like a coiled snake. The figures in the mist still stood at the edge of the water, unmoving. Their hollow eyes stared directly at her window, and their elongated fingers pointed toward the heart of the marsh. The manuscript lay open on the parlor floor. The words, "Come to the marsh," glared back at her, the ink smeared and wet, as if it had been written moments ago. Eliza's breath came in sharp gasps as she backed away from the window. Her trembling hand reached out and gripped the edge of the table, steadying herself. "No," she whispered. "No, I won't go out there." But even as she said it, something deep inside her chest, something she couldn't silence, pulled. The marsh was calling her. The hours passed in a heavy blur. Daylight filtered weakly through the stained glass windows of Hawthorn Estate, but it brought no comfort. Eliza had retreated to the study, clutching the manuscript tightly against her chest. She couldn't leave, but she couldn't stay either. The whispers had grown louder now, like faint breaths against her ear. "Eliza, Eliza, come, see." The hum of the marsh never stopped. At some point, though she wasn't sure when, she fell into a restless sleep, her head resting on the cold wooden desk. She awoke with a start to the sound of knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. Eliza sat up, her pulse roaring in her ears. The room was dim, painted in the bruised colors of twilight. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. A child's face stared back at her from the other side of the glass. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were black, pits of endless shadow. Its mouth stretched into a faint grin, and frost had begun to spread across the pane around its face. "Eliza," the child whispered, though its lips never moved. She stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. "No, you're not real. You're not..." The child raised one pale hand and pressed its palm flat against the glass. The frost spread outward in spiderweb patterns, and then, crack, the glass shattered. Cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the smell of stagnant water and decay. Eliza turned and ran. The halls of Hawthorn Estate were a labyrinth of shadow and whispers. The lanterns along the walls had long since gone out, leaving only faint slivers of twilight creeping through the cracks in the curtains. Eliza ran, her breath sharp and ragged as she stumbled over torn rugs and broken floorboards. Behind her, the whispers followed, a chorus of faint, melodic voices calling her name. She burst into the grand foyer, her boots skidding across the dusty marble floor. The front door loomed ahead, tall and crooked. But something was wrong. Through the cracks in the door, she could see nothing but fog. Thick, churning fog, pressing against the wood like a living thing. "Eliza?" The voice came again, right behind her. She spun around. A figure stood halfway up the grand staircase. It was a woman, tall, draped in a tattered black gown. Her head hung low, her tangled hair obscuring her face. But Eliza could see it, the faint curve of her smile. "Eliza," the figure rasped, her voice distorted and wet, as if she was speaking through water. "You must come to the marsh. They're waiting for you." Eliza's knees went weak, and she stumbled backward into the door. "No, I won't." The woman's head snapped upward with an unnatural crack. Her hollow eyes locked onto Eliza. Her smile stretched wider. "They'll come for you anyway." Eliza fled into the night. The door gave way under her weight, and she stumbled out onto the muddy ground in front of Hawthorn Estate. The fog was suffocating, wrapping around her body like icy fingers. The marsh stretched out ahead of her, its surface slick and glassy under the faint light of the moon. The figures were still there, waiting at the edge of the water. Dozens of them, unmoving, silent. But one of them stepped forward. A child, a girl, no older than 10, her white nightgown stained with something dark, and her hollow eyes fixed on Eliza. "Eliza," the child whispered. The pull was unbearable now. The marsh wanted her. And Eliza couldn't fight it anymore. Her boots sank into the soft, muddy earth as she crossed the threshold into the marsh. Water seeped into her shoes, soaking her stockings and numbing her skin. The cold was relentless, biting into her flesh with every step. The figures watched her, their heads tilting slightly as she passed them. The girl led her deeper into the fog, her bare feet leaving faint impressions in the muddy water. "Eliza, we're almost there," the child said softly, her voice carrying across the still air like a lullaby. The water grew deeper. It reached Eliza's ankles, then her knees, and then she saw it, rising from the center of the marsh like an ancient monument, a stone altar, slick with moss and half submerged in the water. The figures gathered around it, their hollow eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. The girl climbed onto the altar, her nightgown clinging to her thin frame. "Eliza, you must kneel." Eliza's breath caught in her throat, but her body moved on its own. She knelt in the freezing water, her reflection staring back at her from the glassy surface below. The figures began to hum, a low, mournful sound that reverberated through her chest. The girl raised one pale hand and pointed downward. "Look, Eliza." Eliza leaned forward, her face hovering just above the surface of the water. Her reflection stared back at her and smiled. Its lips split into a jagged grin, its teeth sharp, its eyes black and hollow. The water rippled, and her reflection reached upward. Hands, cold, dead hands, broke the surface and grabbed her wrists, pulling her downward. She screamed, but the water rushed into her mouth, cold and choking. The figures hummed louder. The girl on the altar smiled down at her. "Eliza, you're one of us now." The marsh grew still. The fog began to lift, and the figures slowly melted back into the mist. The water returned to its glassy silence, and on the surface of the marsh, just beneath the water, Eliza's face stared upward. Her lips were pulled into a frozen smile, her hollow eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon. The marsh had claimed her, and somewhere in the distance, faint and hollow, came the sound of laughter. The marsh was still. Its glassy surface reflected the pale moonlight, and the faint outlines of the twisted trees clawed at the sky. The fog had settled low, wrapping itself around the skeletal branches like a silken shroud. Beneath the surface, Eliza's face stared upward. Her hollow eyes reflected the moon, and her frozen smile stretched across her pale lips. Her hair floated around her like dark tendrils, and the faint hum of the marsh resonated through the still water. But then, her eyes blinked. Eliza's chest heaved as she gasped for air, breaking through the surface of the water with a violent splutter. Her hands clawed at the slick mud, pulling herself onto the marsh's bank. Her dress clung to her frail body, soaked and dripping with murky water. She lay there for a moment, trembling and gasping, her mind clawing its way back to clarity. She was alive. But how? The figures, the forgotten ones, were gone. The girl in the nightgown, the child who had led her into the marsh, had disappeared into the fog. The water was silent once more. But the humming was inside her now, reverberating through her chest, her bones, her skull. She pushed herself to her feet, her dress heavy with water, and turned back toward the outline of Hawthorn Estate in the distance. The house loomed over the horizon like a silhouette of decay, its windows dark and hollow. But something was different now. The marsh wasn't pulling her anymore. It was following her. The walk back to the estate was slow and disorienting. The trees felt closer, their branches arching low, as if whispering secrets just out of her earshot. The mud clung to her boots, and her dress dragged across the wet earth like a funeral shroud. By the time she reached the estate, the sky had begun to lighten with the faint hues of dawn, but the light brought no comfort. It painted the world in pale, sickly colors. Eliza stumbled up the steps and into the grand foyer, her boots leaving wet prints across the marble floor. The house was silent now, its oppressive weight heavier than before. The manuscript still lay open on the parlor floor, its pages smeared with ink and mud. The faint smell of stagnant water lingered in the air, and somewhere, deep within the walls, a faint drip echoed in slow intervals. Drip, drip, drip. She leaned heavily against the wall, her head spinning. Her reflection stared back at her from the cracked glass of a hallway mirror. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. Her hollow eyes were wide and bloodshot. And her reflection was smiling. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Eliza flinched, her breath catching in her throat. The knock came again, deliberate and steady. Knock, knock, Knock. It was coming from the front door. She hesitated, her trembling fingers reaching for the handle. Slowly, she pulled the heavy wooden door open. Standing on the steps was Silas, the carriage driver. His thin face was creased with worry, his pale eyes darting over her soaked figure and the dark bruises under her eyes. "Miss Wren," he said, his voice hushed. "What happened to you?" Eliza couldn't find the words. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Silas stepped forward cautiously. "You shouldn't have gone to the marsh, miss. No one ever comes back the same." Eliza swallowed hard. "Silas, what are they? The people in the marsh?" The driver's face grew pale, and he glanced over his shoulder toward the distant fog. "They're not people anymore, miss. They were once, but the marsh doesn't let go. They're trapped there, half here, half somewhere else." He hesitated, his voice trembling slightly. Did they speak to you?" Eliza nodded. "They called me. They wanted me." Silas's expression tightened. "You have to leave this place, miss. Tonight. The marsh. It leaves a mark on those who hear it. And if you stay here much longer..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Eliza understood. She glanced back into the shadowed depths of Hawthorn Estate, the air heavy with the weight of old secrets. "Can you take me away from here?" she whispered. Silas nodded. "I'll have the carriage ready by nightfall. Pack what you need. But whatever happens, don't listen to them. Nightfall. The carriage. Ride." The carriage creaked and groaned as it rolled along the frozen path away from Hawthorn Estate. The trees pressed in from both sides, their twisted branches casting skeletal shadows across the path. Eliza sat inside, wrapped tightly in a heavy shawl, her eyes fixed on the window. The fog outside seemed to follow them, curling around the wheels and clinging to the glass. Silas sat rigid in the driver's seat, his eyes darting toward the tree line every few seconds. The humming started faintly at first, a low vibration deep in the earth, threading itself through the wheels, into the wood, and finally into Eliza's chest. She closed her eyes, clutching her shawl tighter, but the humming grew louder. Then came the whispers. "Eliza, you can't leave. You belong to us now." Her hands flew to her ears, but the voices were inside her head. They clawed at her thoughts, curling around her memories and pulling her back toward the marsh. The carriage jolted to a stop. Silas cursed under his breath. No, not now. Eliza looked out the window. The fog had grown impossibly thick. The world beyond was a pale, swirling void, and in the fog, figures began to emerge. They stood motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto the carriage. The girl in the nightgown was among them, her tangled hair hanging over her face, her feet bare on the frozen ground. "Eliza." The child's voice was sharp, cutting through the whispers like a knife. "Come back to us." Silas turned back toward Eliza, his pale face twisted with fear. "Miss Wren, don't look at them. Don't listen. Close your eyes, cover your ears, and do not answer them." But it was too late. The child stepped closer, her hollow eyes piercing into Eliza's soul. "Eliza, don't you want to know the truth?" Eliza's hand trembled on the carriage door. The fog pressed closer. The humming grew unbearable. And then, the carriage door swung open. Cold, skeletal hands reached inside, grabbing Eliza's wrists and pulling her into the fog. Silas screamed her name as the figures melted back into the mist, dragging Eliza with them. The last thing she heard before the fog swallowed her whole was the faint, hollow sound of laughter. The fog swallowed everything. The air was heavy, cold, and damp, pressing against Eliza like invisible hands. Her feet stumbled over roots and stones, her dress trailing through slick mud as she was pulled deeper into the marsh. She couldn't see them, the hands, but she felt them. Icy, skeletal fingers clutched at her wrists, her shoulders, her hair. The whispers coiled around her ears, soft and sharp, overlapping into a dizzying chorus. Eliza, come with us. Eliza, don't fight. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the fog. The ground beneath her feet grew softer, wetter. Her boots sank deeper with every step. She could feel the marsh water seeping into her stockings, rising up her calves, chilling her to the bone. And then, silence. The hands released her. The whisper stopped. Eliza stood frozen in the marsh, her breath sharp and ragged. The fog thinned slightly, revealing faint shapes in the gloom. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the water up to their waists. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their faces slack and expressionless. But they weren't strangers. She recognized them. There was Silas, his sunken eyes and thin face frozen in a look of sorrow. Behind him stood Darlene from the diner, her apron still stained with coffee and grease. Sheriff Cross was there too, his coat hanging heavy with water, his eyes empty. And she froze. At the center of them all stood a young girl in a white nightgown, her hair plastered to her pale face by the damp fog. Her lips curled into a faint smile, her hollow eyes locked onto Eliza's. Eliza, the girl said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. You came back to us. Eliza's voice trembled. Who are you? The girl tilted her head slightly, her smile widening. We are the forgotten ones. We are the echoes of lives stolen by this place. The marsh doesn't just claim bodies. It keeps souls, fragments, memories. And now, she took a step closer, the water rippling softly around her ankles. It keeps you. Eliza stumbled back, her boots slipping in the mud. No, I'm not like you. I'm not. But you are, the girl whispered. You've been marked. You heard the whispers. You answered the call. There's no leaving now, Eliza. The figures in the marsh began to step closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Eliza turned and ran. The marsh was a labyrinth of water and shadows. The fog clung to her face, cold and suffocating, as branches snagged her dress and pulled at her hair. The humming returned, low, deep, vibrating in her bones. She could hear them behind her, the whispers, the splashing footsteps, the faint sound of giggling carried on the wind. You can't run, Eliza! You're already one of us! But she kept running. Ahead, faint through the fog, she saw a flicker of light. Warm, golden light, the light of a lantern. Silas. It had to be Silas. Help me! She screamed, her voice cracking. Please! Help me! The light grew brighter as she stumbled forward, her boots sinking into the muddy ground with every step. But as she burst into the clearing, she froze. The light wasn't from a lantern. It was from a fireplace, inside a small wooden cottage, standing impossibly in the middle of the marsh. Smoke curled from the chimney and faint shadows danced across the frosted windows. The door was slightly ajar, a faint golden glow spilling onto the wet ground. Without hesitation, Eliza ran inside. The cottage was warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and something sweet. Honey, perhaps. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a crackling fire blazed in the stone hearth. But something was wrong. There were no footprints on the wooden floor, no signs of life. "Hello?" Eliza called out weakly. Is anyone here?" Her voice felt small in the cozy silence. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small, framed photograph. She stepped closer, her trembling fingers reaching for the frame. The photograph was faded, the edges yellowed with age. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl in a white nightgown. The girl's eyes were wide, her lips curled into that same faint, haunting smile. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "No," a voice spoke from behind her. "You shouldn't have come here, Eliza." She turned sharply. The girl in the white nightgown stood in the doorway, her pale skin illuminated by the flickering firelight. "This isn't your home," the girl whispered. "But it's mine, and you can't leave." The shadows in the room began to stretch, reaching across the floor like skeletal hands. The fire in the hearth flared bright, then dimmed to a faint blue flicker. The humming started again, low and vibrating, rising in intensity. The girl stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. "It's time, Eliza. Time to join us." Eliza stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as she scrambled for the door. But the shadows were already closing in, the air turning cold and sharp. She ran through the doorway, back into the marsh. But the fog was thicker now, pressing against her skin, filling her lungs. The figures were waiting, the forgotten ones, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the mist. The girl's voice carried across the marsh, clear and sharp. "Let her in." The figures began to move, their pale hands reaching out from the fog, their hollow faces frozen in expressions of endless sorrow. Eliza screamed, her voice breaking as she tried to push them away. But their hands gripped her arms, her shoulders, her hair. The marsh water rose around her, climbing her waist, her chest, her neck. The last thing she saw was the girl in the white nightgown, standing at the edge of the water, her faint smile illuminated by the pale moonlight. "Eliza," the girl whispered softly, "now you'll never be alone again." The water closed over Eliza's head. The marsh rippled once. Then it was still. Epilogue. Weeks later. The fog had lifted over Black Hollow. The marsh was quiet, its surface smooth and reflective under the pale light of dawn. But something new had appeared near the water's edge. A faint figure, standing in the mist. It was a woman, her dress tattered and clinging to her frail frame. Her hair hung in wet strands over her pale face, and her lips were curled into a faint, frozen smile. Her hollow eyes stared endlessly across the still water. And if you were quiet enough, if you listened just right, you could hear her voice. Soft, faint. "Come, come to the marsh." Somewhere in the distance, carried on the cold wind, came the faint sound of laughter. But it wasn't joyful. It was hollow, and it was endless.